All right, so now we're going to start the second half of Chapter 7. And 7.4 through 7.8 will be our next test. There will be no quiz, but just a test, because you'll see it all kind of goes together, and we'll be reviewing and reviewing as we go along. So this first section, though, is about solving polynomial equations in factored form. So we are going to be solving. And remember, when we solve an equation, that means we get an answer that looks like x equals 5 or something like that. And it's the solution that makes that equation true. So we're going to start off with this one right here. Solve 3 times what equals 0. Well, this is really key for this section. I think we will all agree that x equals 0, because the only way we're going to get 0 as an answer, 3 times 0 is 0. That's it. So what about if we have x times y equals 0? Well, if we have two things that are multiplying together that equals 0, the only way we can get an answer of 0 when we multiply is if either x is 0 or y is 0. That's the only way. One of those numbers has to be 0, or we'll never get 0 for an answer. And so we are going to use this property. This is called and it's our key idea over here, our zero product property, which says if the product of two real numbers is 0, then at least one of the numbers is 0. All right, so that's basically what we just said earlier with x and y. If x times y is 0, one of those variables, x or y, or both, has to be 0. Well, we're going to use this zero product property to help us solve equations like this next one. We have two things being multiplied together that equals 0, so it's in its factored form. And we're going to leave it that way because it's kind of like our previous example. We have two things being multiplied together that equals 0, which means either my first parenthesis has to be 0 or my second parenthesis has to be 0. Is this 0 or is this 0, right? One of those parentheses has to be 0 in order for the two factors to have an answer of 0. Well, if we solve these, we get either x equals -3 or plus 3, x equals +3. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You're thinking, I could look at those parentheses and just tell you the answer. I know 3 minus 3 is 0, or -3 plus 3 is 0. Well, it's your lucky day because you can. Let's take a look at this next example. This is like the previous one. We have this times this equals 0. We have two things multiplying together to equal 0. So either this first thing has to be 0 or the second factor has to be 0. Well, for the first factor to be 0, x has to equal 0. For the second factor to equal 0, x minus 4, if x is 4, 4 minus 4 is 0. So you don't have to write it out. You don't have to write out 2x equals 0 or x minus 4 equals 0 and solve it. If you can look at it and come up with the answer, great. This next example, B, either this is 0 or this is 0. They're both multiplying together to equal 0. So x is either equal to 5 because 5 minus 5 is 0, or x equals 2 because 2 minus 2 is 0. Now for this last one, this one is a little more challenging. Either this first parenthesis has to equal 0 or the second parenthesis has to equal 0. For this one, I'm going to write it out because it's not just x minus 3 or x plus 5. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So if it's a little more complicated, write it out and solve. So we're going to subtract 4 from each side. 2x equals -4. Divide both sides by 2. x equals 2. So that's one answer. Or over here, we're going to add 5 to both sides. Again, we set each parenthesis equal to 0 and solve. Divide by 3. Or 5/3. So x is equal to 2 or 5/3. Well, what about if it's written this way? Well, we know that this means this. And either this equals 0 or this equals 0. Well, if x equals -4, that, or both, parentheses will be 0. And so sometimes you can have repeat parentheses and just get one answer. For this next example, you could try it on your own. You can always pause the video if you want to try it on your own first. We need to set, now these are 3 things multiplied to equal 0. Well, it's the same idea. If you have any number of things multiplying together to equal 0, at least one of those factors has to be 0. So we're going to set each of these parentheses equal to 0 and solve. So for my first parenthesis, I can see it's 3 because 3 minus 3 is 0. For my second parenthesis, the answer is -8 because -8 plus 8 is 0. But for my third parenthesis, I don't quite know that one, so I'm going to write it out. Plus 2 plus 2, 3x equals 2, divide by 3, x equals 2/3. So 3 parentheses, 3 answers potentially. Now, in addition to solving equations that are already factored, we're going to do a little bit of factoring ourselves, at least factoring out the greatest common factor, abbreviated GCF. So when we look at our first example here, factor out the greatest common factor from 4x to the 4th plus 24x cubed. We have to look at each part. So looking at the numbers, what's the largest number that can evenly divide into, or is a factor of, 4 and 24? Well, that number is 4, right? And then when we look at the x's, what's the greatest amount of x's we could divide each term by? Well, whatever the lowest is, right? So x cubed. Notice what we're going to do now is we're going to divide each parenthesis, or I'm sorry, each term by 4x cubed. And we're going to factor it out. So when we divide the first term by 4x cubed, what we're left with is x plus, and then 24 divided by 4 is 6. All those x cubes cancel out, and that's it. So we're looking for that greatest common factor, dividing everything by it, and pulling it outside the parenthesis. You can see, because we're pros at putting it back in, that if you multiplied that back in, you would get right back to where you started. We're not going to do that, though, because we want it in its factored form. All right, let's factor out the greatest common factor from this now. So looking at 12 and 9, again, you could always pause the video and try it on your own first. I think 3 is the biggest number that can go into both. So we're going to divide each by 3. And then with the x's, remember it's whatever the lowest is. So x to the 4th is the most we can take out. So dividing each term by 3x to the 4th, looks like we're going to get 4x minus 3. And so that is our answer, factoring. So now we're going to combine all those things we did so far into our last problems here. We are going to solve the equation by factoring. Okay, well, I'm just going to put by factoring. So, because we have the x squared and the x, and we just can't add and subtract and get x by itself. So, taking out the greatest common factor here, that would be 2x. We're going to divide both terms by 2x. So, I'm going to move that down a little bit. I'm going to do one of the tricks you guys always do. Whoops, we're going to move that down a little bit. So, when we factor out 2x, we're going to be left with, x plus 4 equals 0. So now it's like the problems we started with. This times this equals 0, which means x is equal to 0 or negative 4. Let's try the one underneath, this one first. So, if we look at our what we could factor out, greatest common factor, it looks like 2m. So we're going to factor out 2m. Move this up a little bit. And when we do that, we're going to be left with 9 minus m equals 0. Which now, if we set each factor equal to 0, we're going to get m is equal to 0 or 9. All right, these last two problems are a little bit different. Notice, whenever we solved by factoring, it always equaled 0. Like, we have to have it equal 0 because then we can set each term, or each factor, I should say, equal to 0 to solve it. So the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to subtract 15n from both sides so that when we rewrite it, it looks like this. Because we want it to equal 0. That is a key. So now that we did that, we can factor out the greatest common factor, which to me looks like 3m. So if we factor out 3m, we're going to be left with 2m minus 5 equals 0. Oh boy, I'm running out of room here. That's right, I'll move my next one a little bit lower. So setting each factor equal to 0, that gives us m equals 0. And then let's see, what's 2m minus 5? If we set that equal to 0, we're going to add 5 to both sides. 2m equals 5, divided by 2. M equals 5 halves. So 0 and 5 halves is my answer. Now, my last problem, this one right here, we're going to move it down here. Negative 28r equals 4r squared. So I'm going to move this over to the other side. So I have my first term is still positive, 4r squared plus 28r is equal to 0. All right, so now let's see. Looks like 4r is going to be my greatest common factor, which is going to leave me with r plus 7, which means r is equal to 0 or negative 7, setting each factor equal to 0. And there you go, a lot to digest. Factoring out the greatest common factor, and then also solving by factoring, by setting each factor equal to 0. Once it's in its factored form, the equation must equal 0 in order to apply that property.